take this one. Wonderful. So let me start. Well, that was immediately stopping my slides. Maybe I have to practice this a little. Could you give me the slides back, the technicians? I like to see my bow tie, but not that much. No, I guess they have a problem. Okay, well, this is the picture on which I wanted to start. So this is a picture of my hometown Tübingen at the time when I went to school. Why am I showing you this picture? Well, because it demonstrates that I, almost by my DNA, love a good debate. Therefore, I feel deeply honored by Margaret Archer writing a full comment paper on my contribution. And this comment paper poses a series of really deep questions. But if I try to do them justice, my presentation would shift to the meta level. I would have to say something about are descriptive models and empirical methods inherently normative? What do we think about Aristotle's basic claim that the whole is more than the sum of its parts? In which ways do what I essentially talk about in the paper, personal traits, and what I do not so much talk about, perceived situation, interact with each other? And to the extent that there is one, does the conceptual divide between Margaret Archer and myself translate into testable propositions? So it would be a very interesting program, only it would be essentially a different paper. And I thought I owe you that I first give you a chance to understand what I did, and then that you hear Margaret Archer reacting to it, and maybe in the Q&A time we can have a bit of this debate. So what is the research question of my paper? Essentially, you can say we are here to understand to which degree we can help Catholic social teaching. And my question is, do we need interventions to achieve what Catholic social teaching wants? Or is solidarity actually a resource on which Catholic social teaching can capitalize? So that's the question I will be talking about. Another way of putting this research question is, do those two, the left one of course being the Pope, the right one my students in the lab, do they have anything in common? Seemingly very little. This is a very mundane setting. My students work for money, and I do everything to exclude anything that could evoke familiar context, because the name of the game is identification, and I want to exclude confounds. So superficially there is a big difference, but even more so in a deeper sense there is a big difference in that my exercise is positive. I want, and not in a normative sense positive, but positive in a scientific sense. It's descriptive if you wish. I want to understand things, maybe explain them, whereas Catholic social teaching is essentially a normative exercise. I, in the paper, try to confront what, partly from my own data, partly from data of colleagues, can be said with Catholic social teaching, with, of course, essentially is a normative thing, and even more importantly, is essentially deontological, in that it is derived from theological first principles, whereas all I have to say is, if at all, it has a normative flavor in a utilitarian perspective. So what I try is to nonetheless build a bridge between the two. And how do I want to do that? Well, experimental economics, which is basically the toolbox I rely on, tries to find out under as controlled conditions as you possibly could get, generalizable behavioral traits, and to the degree that we think we find them, we also want to theorize them, always going back and forth between the building of behavioral theory and the testing of it. I confront this with the exercise that I think, for good reason, is not called Catholic social theorizing. It is called Catholic social teaching. So it serves a practical purpose, and The question to which I want to contribute here is, to which degree is there not just a way of saying what things should be, but to which degree is there a gap between what we would wish things to be and what they actually are? Another way of making the same claim is, to which degree is there a need for normatively backed up intervention? And to the degree that the answer is yes, there is a need for intervention, then we want to say something about how much of an intervention, how severe of an intervention, which kind of an intervention. So we want to address shape and scope of a potential intervention, and I hope I can, with my data, contribute a little bit to that exercise. How do I want to go about it? I will have three parts. The first one will be the longest, and I'm a deep optimist, so I will first give you the optimistic view. And you could say, looking at quite some literature, that to a remarkable degree, what Catholic social teaching calls for is actually found in typical experimental populations. But there is some water in our nice Italian wine. There will be a series of rather pessimistic qualifications, which is why the bottom line of my talk will not be everything has been done, let's go home, but rather there is a case for Catholic social teaching, but we hopefully understand a bit better what this intervention could and should look like. I will, for the first part of my talk, confront sentences from essentially one encyclica with things I find in my experiments. Of course, this is an exercise in building analogs. It's obvious that I will not have a direct mapping, but it's suggestive enough so that I find it's interesting to see to which degree we find data that seems to speak to the things that Catholic social teaching wants to be achieved. So the closest quote I was able to find in that encyclica, and it's always, if it's in italics, it's verbal quotes. It is the commitment to the good of one's neighbor that this encyclica calls for. Now, how do I want to see whether there is something to it in the lab? I use probably the most simple game you could run, the dictator game. For those of you who have not seen those games, they're very, very simple. You have random assignment of anonymously interacting people. They are sitting behind my blue curtains, and one of the players is assigned an active role, the other player is assigned a passive role. The active player gets some mana from heaven, and the action set of the active player is that he or she is free to keep everything, free to give everything to the passive player, or do anything in between. So it's a continuous action space. Now this is a meta-study which I did on a little more than 20,000 observations. So it's a really robust finding from a huge literature. By eyeballing, you immediately see this is not one mean and then a noise term. We see patterned heterogeneity. We see essentially three types. We see the biggest bar, that's 35 or so percent, they are textbook selfish. I wouldn't say they are psychopaths, that's a bit strong, but the economic textbook applies to them. They see this as a game where you can make some money, and they take the money. You see another spike at the very middle of the distribution. That is participants who say, I got 10 coins, let me give the other guy 5, so that both of us have the same. And then we find a bunch of people in between. So they are a bit less generous, but at least they feel that in this situation they shouldn't keep everything. And we find a few that give even more, and some 5% that give everything. No, okay. You can push the parallel a little further, again quoting from the encyclica. The encyclica warns against the desire for profit and that thirst for power, and contrasts this with calling for a sense of moral responsibility. And you can say that this too is echoed in the dictator game results, in that the typical game is completely anonymous, and anonymity goes that far that even after the experiment is over, you have no chance to figure out who did good to you. So you are, even as a benefactor, deprived of the possibility to receive some gratitude, some recognition for your being a nice person. When these games had first been run, some people tried to theorize them, of course, and thought, well, now we see altruism. And early on, Andreoni and co-authors had a very nice test of this proposition. They compared two treatments. In one treatment, a unit kept is multiplied by 3. In the other treatment, everything else held constant, a unit given is multiplied by 3. Guess what? In the second treatment, 32% of giving on average, in the other, only 20% of giving. So that already shows those who give are sensitive to cost-benefit relationships, which they should not if they were pure altruists. So pure altruism is probably not a good idea. What is a much more plausible idea, but not necessarily the last word, is inequity aversion. Let me first again go back to the encyclica, saying that the injustice of the poor distribution of goods and services is something that has to be cured, and it also points out that there are points of contact between solidarity and charity. No direct mapping, of course, but it resonates with the idea that people receive in economic parlance disutility from being ahead of others. And this disutility is reduced the more the others have in the first place. This is what my bars on the right-hand side are meant to show you, again taken from the meta-study. So this is going over experiments that gave the recipient at least something in the first place. So you interacted in the dictator game with a recipient who was not at 0, but who had, if you had 10, had 1 or 2 or up till 10. Now, this doesn't look like a straight line. This is a statistical artifact because it's aggregated over all experiments that differed in many other respects. But if you look at, by eyeballing at the slope is clearly downward. So the more the other has, the less I feel under an obligation to also give that person something. That suggests that many dictators feel that inequality, inequity is something they dislike. Another way of rationalizing these results is also echoed both by the encyclica and by the data. The encyclica first, it calls for caring for those who do not succeed in realizing their basic human vocation because they are deprived of essential goods. Economists would say this resonates with the fairness norm of need. So those who are much more deprived of a possibility to develop themselves should get more. Now, how is that reflected in the data? No need to look into details, just the big expression. The left-hand data is the standard dictator game, so that's the same data you saw before, just a little compressed. The right-hand data is the same game, only now the recipient is not another student in the lab. Now the recipient is deserving. Typically, it's a well-renowned charity. Just look at two bars. If on the left-hand side, the biggest bar is the very leftmost bar. That's the selfish guys keeping everything. On the right-hand side, the biggest bar is the rightmost bar. So that's participants giving everything. So as soon as they think it's a worthy cause, they feel the urge to give more. Another way of rationalizing the feeling of solidarity, again, the encyclica first, members recognize one another as persons. In economic theorizing, you would say, now we are talking identity utility. I use a slightly more involved game to say something on the data side about this, the public goods game, which is, we heard this frequently, a social dilemma. The group is best off if all contribute fully to a joint project. The individual is best off by not contributing anything. Thus far, it's just the workhorse, but now comes the manipulation. That's one of our experiments. We manipulated identity. How did we do that? If you first look at the manipulation, and then I'll explain the graphs. So we had a baseline where there was no identity manipulation and compared it to 3 treatments. It was a repeated game, so after the end of each period, we asked them in private, and it was clear that what they said would never go to anybody else but us. What do you think others think you will do? For the economists in the room, the second order beliefs. What do you think should ideally be done? That's a normative question. Or what do you think should minimally be done? That's a normative question with another flavor. And now it's a bit small, I hope you can nonetheless see it. There is a lower line, which, if you can see the colors, is blue. That's the baseline, so you get the standard pattern. People are nice in the beginning, they realize there are some free riders around, so over time cooperation deteriorates. And all manipulations help. But I didn't talk about statistics today, but let me reveal that bit. The 2 left things are not significant at conventional levels, whereas the rightmost difference is, so if you manipulate what they think is the norm in this context, and say, and by the way, don't tell me your grand ideas about what in an ideal world without constraints is going to happen. Tell me what you think should be done given all constraints. Then this indeed has a significant effect. It isn't perfect. We get a strong endgame effect, so they become selfish at some point, but at least we see that the manipulation works. Sounds good. I mean, sounds almost too good to be true, because you could say, well, let's stop with Catholic social teaching. Mission was successful. Let me now qualify again with data from the lab. So one first concern echoes very well what we had over both days. It's not sufficient that people are nice to each other. If you want to help the poorest of the poor, somebody must earn the money. And those who earn the money must still be happy to exert effort. And therefore, in this game, which is a distribution game, we were interested in seeing whether imposing redistribution would reduce effort. So the 2 graphs, the left-hand graph is another intensity manipulation, this time a little bit different from the other games. Here we made it more complicated for people to earn money. They could always get as much as they wanted, but it became harder and harder to do that. And you see a wonderful upward trend, so the more people suffer from earning their living, the more others think, okay, we should help them by redistributing. Fine. If you now look at the right-hand graph, there we flipped things around, and same subjects, but other part of the experiment, now manipulated the degree of redistribution. And the bars are a bit small, so they run from no redistribution up till 45%. So 45% of what you earn is what you have to give. And you see there is an upward slope. So there is a social cost on imposing redistribution. And now you can say, is this glass half full or is it half empty? I don't want to pass judgment here. It's a downward trend. It is much less steep than you might have been afraid. Second qualification, a bit more troublesome. I gave you lots of data on the dictator game. The dictator game has one simple limitation. You can be selfish in the game as a dictator, but that's where it stops. Your action space is between giving nothing and giving everything. Out there in the world, you can be much nastier than giving nothing. You can take. And this game on the left-hand side is a repetition of a standard dictator game, and on the right-hand side, taking is allowed. Watch out. The highest bar is now taking the maximum that is allowed. So if only you give them a chance to be bad, by the simple opportunity, quite a few participants actually get bad. We radicalized that in one of our own experiments, where we didn't even give them a chance to give. So we had anonymous matching, and we put the dictator game upside down. So all you can do is take, you cannot give. But since the research question was about the effectiveness of punishment, we introduced a punishment. And the original treatment which we did is the rightmost panel, where, because I thought my typical participants are very nice, so probably they won't steal in the first place. So let's make it very appealing for them to steal. So it was really a good deal for you if you wanted to steal in expectation. And yes, they did. They steal like rabbits. And then my co-author said, that's good. Now we want to see how far we can push things. And we had the middle bar where a rational person in terms of economics, so a person that maximizes profit, would just be indifferent between taking and not taking. An expectation, this person has the same. Look at that, still more stealing than not stealing. And then we went yet one step further, and that's the leftmost panel, where we made stealing a fairly bad deal. So in expectation, you lost money by stealing. Some people understood, quite a few people were still stealing if only the opportunity was given to them. So that is quite some water into the wine. Another one, not our experiment, but a wonderful study from colleagues, is what if in the dictator game, you give the dictator a chance to not revealing the game to the recipient. So the design is, you are told you are a dictator in a dictator game. If you want to pay a little money, then I won't tell the recipient that this is a dictator game and that you have been dictator. The gray bars are the data from that. You see more than 70% of the dictators pay money for not declaring that they could have given money to others. So, well, they're not so nice people. And the devastating bit of data comes from psychologists. That's a dictator game run as Las Vegas. The economists frown at that because there is lots of stuff economists are not allowed to do in the lab, but it's a great story. It is at a Las Vegas bus station and uses two Confederates. One is seemingly busy with a phone call. Another one arrives and claims, "Oh, I have to rush to the airport. I do still have a few casino chips. You can have them," to the participant. And then a final sentence while going away. "Oh, by the way, if you wish to share some of this with the guy over there, feel free." Nobody shared anything. Everybody was plain selfish in this situation. That's really devastating to the literature. So, what's the bottom line? I dare say it's mixed. Or more precisely, given the experimental data, you could say that the typical human participant is good-natured but feeble. The good news from the lab is there's a considerable amount of what you could call solidarity. The bad news from the lab and the field is this is fragile and context-dependent. So that I would claim there is a case for not Catholic social theorizing, but Catholic social teaching. Solidarity cannot be taken for granted, but it must also not be enforced. It suffices to induce it. Let me conclude with a view to Margaret, Father, I have been a methodological individualist. Thank you.